You can start, introduce yourself and your position.
Start talking, okay. My name is Patrick Hughes. I'm the Director of Behavioral Health Services for the Bergen County Sheriff's Department, specifically at the Bergen County Jail. I've been there for approximately 24 years now, and most of my time is spent dealing with mental health issues inside the jail. Basically, at the Bergen County Jail, we admit approximately 8,000 individuals a year through our system, of which 15% or so have a significant mental illness. That's a sort of a national average that is true really wherever you go. So our primary role is to provide screening, evaluation, identification, treatment, of course, to all the mentally ill folks who come through the jail. Every single individual who comes through receives an initial mental health screening that seeks to evaluate and to learn whether they have any suicidal ideation. Of course, our primary concern is safety and security out of jail, but we of course want to learn about any potential suicidal ideation. But beyond that, we also want to know if there is a history of mental illness, if anybody has taken medication, any of those kinds of concerns with somebody that's coming in. Basically, the Bergen County Jail is really the equivalent of sort of like a small city. We have men and women in the facility. It's an adult correctional facility, so technically you need to be 18 or older to be incarcerated there, although sometimes we get juveniles who are waived up. But just like any small city, we have all the same issues. There are issues of physical health, mental health. People have to figure out once they're incarcerated, how do they cover their rents and mortgages, and who takes care of their cat if they're incarcerated. I mean, really anything you can think of if your life was sort of interrupted has to be dealt with. So, of course, mental health is a huge issue, as it's pretty widely known now. There are more mentally ill in jails than there are in mental health facilities, inpatient mental health facilities for sure. So, every single individual is screened, like I mentioned, on suicidal ideation and further, evidence of mental illness. Once they are screened, we house them appropriately. So if someone has any kind of suicidal ideation, they're placed on suicide precautions, of course. So we call that level 1 in our jail. Specific, very safe units that they're placed in, cells that they're placed in which they can't harm themselves, in uniforms that they're not able to harm themselves with, until such time as someone comes in and performs an evaluation on them. The remainder of the folks are placed probably in general population. There are some step downs from level 1. The jail is unique in some sense in that for county jails it has its own identified unit for the mentally ill, our C2 unit, and that is really roughly the equivalent of a short-term care facility in any other hospital. Most of the folks in there would probably qualify for a place like a Greystone or an Ann Klein. In fact, many of them are either waiting or have had evaluations at Ann Klein, forensic evaluations, to determine whether they are competent, not guilty by reason of insanity, those kinds of items. So once someone's in the jail, the Sheriff's Department maintains 4 licensed clinical social workers or LPCs who are responsible for providing either substance abuse or mental health treatment. So we also maintain 3 part-time psychiatrists, about close to 30 hours of on-site psychiatric coverage per week, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of on-call coverage. We also maintain a relationship with Bergen Regional Medical Center, our D1 unit, which is an 11-bed treatment unit. 5 beds are dedicated towards physical health, and 6 beds are towards behavioral health, so that any individual in the jail who cannot be managed inside the jail for whatever the reason, decompensation, refusal to take medication, we have the ability to send them up to the hospital where they can get, really just the standard hospital-based treatments and interventions to give them the stabilization they need to be able to function back in the jail. That's, edit that part out.
Yep.
And we'll just kind of, that's, I just try to give you an overview. I think that's.
Okay, let's see.
You want to talk about this?
The INC.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So, okay. So one of the biggest challenges that we have at the jail, I mean, of course, managing the mentally ill, depending on the severity of the illness and the insight that that individual has and the responsibility they're taking for their own care, it can be a really challenging endeavor, as anybody working with acutely mentally ill could tell you. But what makes it particularly challenging is that we have sort of this revolving door. You know, again, anybody working in a county jail would be able to describe the same thing, in that very oftentimes there's medication noncompliance, and we see individuals come back and forth throughout the system. In fact, one time I did sort of a quick study of our C2 population, and approximately the average amount of time that those individuals were in a state psychiatric facility was about 5. Some were 10, 15. So, you know, we're all seeing sort of these same people come back and forth. Part of what happens is that because there's this balance that takes place between protecting someone's civil liberties, but then also providing public safety, it gets very, very tricky. So while we can't force someone to take medication if they are not a danger to themselves or others, we know that once they stop taking medication, you know, very often they can become unstable and then are either arrested for, you know, it could be violence, but it could be other things as well. They come back into the system, and we also know that those individuals who have severe mental illness who come into the jail spend almost 3 times the amount of time in jail than those who are arrested who don't have serious mental illness. And the reason for that is because, you know, once the person comes into the system and it's evident that they may be incompetent or there's certainly, you know, evidence of instability, their attorneys have to figure out what to do with them. You know, where am I going to, you know, how am I going to pursue this? If it's such an instance where the person needs a competency evaluation, that can take a while. It's not only costly, but on the public route, going down to Ann Klein Forensic Center, you know, it can take months for that to take place. And the judge has to get the report, review it, and so all of that is an extra piece that has to take place for this population that really wouldn't be true for somebody else. Then, of course, when someone is discharged, you know, we do provide discharge plans for people who are released. But, of course, they're adults. And so, like for anybody in the community, it's really up to them to comply with that. In most cases, they are not required. They may be required, say, through probation or parole or those cases, but we know that oftentimes they don't follow through, and then they sort of come back. And, you know, the precipitator for that is often not taking the medications. I know that recently the outpatient commitment law, which I know has been on the books for a little while, has received some additional funding, and the hope would be is that there can be some leverage for folks who are coming out, where the judicial arm can really require people to follow through on taking their medication and treatment, you know, prior to them destabilizing and decompensating and then winding up back in our facilities. Because really, when you see a unit like C2, you recognize immediately that jail is not really the right place for them. You know, they're safe, they're secure, we provide good care for them, but the reality is that, you know, it's mental illness. It's not really criminal behavior, but in most cases. So my hope is that with the outpatient commitment law, if it can become funded properly, and you know, it really could accomplish a lot by diverting people away from the criminal justice system and keeping them within the mental health system.
Okay, yeah, what else?
Do you have any?
Yeah, what percentage of people in the jail have you diagnosed with mental illness?
So the numbers, when we start to talk about the mentally ill in jail, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, you know, keeps some great data, you know, on their website about all sorts of things about, you know, jail, you know, the inmate demographics. So regarding mental illness, what we know is that we know that mental illness has broad definitions. You know, you can go from dysthymia to adjustment disorders to ADHD. I mean, you know, and you know, to psychotic disorders, thought disorders, mood disorders. So when we include all of those, you know, the numbers that I've seen is that approximately 65% of the individuals in jail would meet some sort of a diagnosis. Really, in actuality, if you include substance abuse within that, it's 100%. I mean, you know, people are in jail, their lives are unstable. There's a reason for all that, right? When we start to talk and we drill that down a little bit more to things sort of like bipolar, psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, major depression, some of the more debilitating, mental illnesses, the numbers are roughly, 12 to 15%. And now in our facility, that plays out to be about 100 folks at any given time, have a major significant acute mental illness.
And have you seen a trend from, you've been doing this for how long?
24 years.
24 years,
Yeah.
and in those 24 years, do you see a trend? What are some of that?
Yeah, I mean, the trend that I see in 24 years is when I started, at the jail 24 years ago, we had a very, very small unit called Post 9. And we probably had, there were these 4 or 5, 6, 7, a handful of severely mentally ill who, everybody kind of knew, and they were sort of in this sort of protected environment. Now that unit has grown to, 20, 25, 30, and just like in a community mental health setting, we try to provide the least restricted housing environment, possible, because that's kind of how it works in the world. You have to, function at the highest level that you're capable of functioning. So most of our mentally ill are in general population, and really they do just fine. We do provide a very secure, structured environment, in general population, in all of our populations. But yeah, the numbers have increased, and we see that it's more difficult, to get people sometimes placed in residential types of settings where you see that they really need it. Dealing with somebody now who we know will be back, but because he's been found competent and he does not want to pursue a not guilty by reason of insanity, he's going to have time served, and likely he won't even get probation. He's not a violent individual, hasn't been charged with any violence, but it's sort of well known that he'll likely be back in a very short period of time.
What do you have to say about what's the impact on the shortage of state and county and community psychiatric beds? What's the impact of that on?
The shortage of beds, well, because we're a correctional facility, we don't have a shortage of beds. I mean, we have how do I say this?
I think
No.
Yeah.
Because there's a shortage of beds, they're not in places where they should be, where they
Oh,
should be.
yeah.
Years ago, there were mental hospitals all over, and
Yeah,
now
okay.
they're called
Yeah,
jails and
yeah.
mental.
The
Yeah.
deinstitutionalization.
Deinstitutionalization, right, okay, so I got you.
That's where I'm going.
Okay, gotcha. So, yeah, I mean, it seems that, when we look at our population, there are certain individuals you just know cannot make it on their own on the street. They just really can't. They need a high level of supervision. They really need, permanent residential placement, and it's become more and more difficult. We see people who come in who get, community placements. They're coming out of Greystone and they get placed, and I think Greystone does a great job. The state mental health system does a great job. It's just that that there's some people probably need to need what was traditionally years ago, they would have these permanent residential settings, and I know we've kind of gotten away from that, and I think there's really good reasons to get away from it, but there's also good reasons to have more of those kinds of options, because again, these are the folks that we see back and forth and back. Once you see somebody in the jail, we have a guy here, this is his 20th time in the jail. Once you see somebody in the jail for the 20th time, that person cannot make it on their own. They cannot make it on their own. They need the kind of structure. Quite frankly, they wind up, kind of trickling down into the structure that they, I don't want to say need, but they're going to wind up with, which is a jail, and yeah, that's what happens. And, this individual that I'm thinking of gets real nervous when he gets out because he knows in jail, he knows what to expect, where he has to be, what's going to happen. And, anecdotally, that's kind of, really what's called for him, and it's difficult. It's difficult to access.
What does the future hold?
Hopefully the future holds, things like a mental health court, that there is a specific judicial response that is more meaningful than what exists now. I mean, everybody's frustrated with this, Judges want to have as many options as they can when they're dealing with somebody, and unfortunately with the mentally ill, it's this very difficult process that you have to go through to figure out, this lengthy, difficult process to figure out, what do I do with this individual? It's very nuanced. I think that there's enough of these kinds of cases, it's costly enough, it's cumbersome enough that, it'd be great to see, that there'd be more of a sort of a niche focus in the criminal justice system to address this. And there are models for that, you know, around the country. I don't claim to be an expert on them. I know I've been aware of them. I've done a little bit of reading on them. But, you know, just similar to why drug court was really created is because it was just so obvious that with the drug, you know, epidemic that was going on in this country, that they were just clogging the courts and really putting somebody in jail and then expecting them to come out a year later with the same drug problem they went in with. You know, people quickly caught on that there's no expectation these folks were really going to just get better by virtue of that there was an intervention needed. And certainly the mentally ill are no different.
Essex County just started a mental health drug court.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that they were exploring
Just
that.
started that.
That's great. That's great.
Are there other ones in the country?
There's ones around. I can't off the top of my head, you know, think of ones to refer you to. I mean, but you know, the model is out there, and it seems to be pretty effective.
Have you talked about it in Bergen County?
You know, as far as I know, I mean, I think that people kind of whisper about these things, but you know, so far as I know, I haven't heard anything concrete as far as developing something in Bergen.
Okay.
What's the cost of treating people with mental health problems in jails?
That is a good question. The cost of treating the mentally ill in jail is tricky to figure out because we spend, you know, at least $25,000 a month on psychotropic medication at the jail. That number could go as high as $30,000. You know, psychotropic medications are expensive. And so just one individual could cost, you know, $1,500 a month for his medication if he had such a type of mental illness and, you know, was unstable enough. Some medications are less expensive, but it's an expensive proposition in general. You know, I've heard different numbers, you know, thrown around, you know, $35,000 a year, $55,000 a year. It really depends on who you're talking about. If you have to be hospitalized a number of times, you know, the cost for you goes way up, right? If your medication is expensive. So it's tricky to throw that number out. Suffice it to say, it's much more expensive than a general population inmate. I mean, I would say that it's easily, you know, twice as expensive.
What would you like ideally to see that would prevent actions or a result of their mental illness? What would you like to see happen so
Well,
that they don't land in jail?
Well, what happened, I don't know that it's realistic to say that they're not going to land in jail. And I think we need to be fair to our local law enforcement partners in the community because they have a responsibility for public safety, and it is really not fair to ask them to, and I know that's not what we were saying, they're going to need to respond. So I think that we sort of have to expect that there's going to be, you know, there's going to be legal involvement. But I think the idea is that on a much quicker basis, to be able to identify people and get them through the justice system much quicker, and to be able to get more timely evaluations. I mean, Ann Klein, you know, they're providing so much service for the state. Not only do they provide forensic evaluations, but they provide acute stabilization. You know, at the Bergen County Jail, we have the luxury, we have a relationship that we develop with Bergen Regional where if we need somebody to become stabilized, we can send them up to the hospital, we get them back, we can kind of control that flow. For the other counties who don't have those relationships, they've sent their folks to Ann Klein. So Ann Klein is doing forensic evaluations, acute stabilization. You know, they're being tasked with a lot of activity. So the ideal would be is that as soon as someone comes in, there's an immediate evaluation that's performed, you know, similar to sort of what we do at the jail. Some of this is probably already in place, but then to get the judicial attention right away. And that requires, you know, participation from, say, the prosecutor's public defender and from the judge. And that's really the idea of what a mental health court is. So it's the notion of being able to have the resource of an evaluation and to have a quicker judicial response so that the person can be processed and placed back out. And then on the back end, having the kinds of services that really can hold people accountable. I think sometimes the challenge is that in protecting someone's civil liberties, and I'm not suggesting we should reduce those, but it becomes a problem because, you know, someone goes off their medication, we're just kind of waiting for the decompensation to take place that we kind of all know is going to happen. And because they're not threatening somebody and they don't meet all the criteria for imminent dangerousness and all those criteria that we're aware of, there's sort of this waiting game that gets played. And I don't know that there's a perfect solution for that, but I think that is definitely one of the challenges.
Is there a program in Dade County?
Yeah, Miami and Dade County is where the drug court started, and I think that they had done something with the mental health court as well. I'm not positive.
We were talking about costs. When someone is an inmate in jail, can you use their health insurance or not?
No, actually, we can't. So all of the coverage that is provided for medical and mental health care, prescriptions, everything, hospitalizations, is covered. The jail has to cover that expense. So we are self-insured for the inmates in that regard. There is some talk about the new Affordable Care Act, and the Affordable Care Act as it would apply to the inmate population. There is something called the inmate exception, in which even though someone in the jail will be eligible for Medicaid and be eligible while they're in the jail, there's an FFP, a federal financial participation piece on the federal level that does not fund that. So it's called the inmate exception. And so they're not eligible for reimbursements right now. There is an exception out there where post 24 hours, if an inmate is sent to the hospital, there is some potential to be able to look at Medicaid reimbursement at that point, and we're looking into that.
If you could say one call to action or takeaway, what would it be?
I think I had kind of said that before. I think that in the sort of notion of a call to action, I think that there's more awareness that has developed, right? So I make the statement before, hey, we all know that there's more mentally ill in jails, than there are in psychiatric facilities, and I'm hearing that at meetings. So I hear people kind of repeating that as a little bit of the mantra of what's going on, and it's really true. So I think the kind of call to action is to say, what's the intervention that's needed, and I think that's what I was alluding to before, is that a sort of a much quicker response to get folks back into a mental health system, and so and we can prevent kind of these lengthy delays in jails and on the back end to have some teeth to these kind of commitment levels, so that people can't keep falling through the cracks based on, and I hate to say it this way, but based on their civil liberties, because I don't want to sound like I'm against civil liberties, right? So I'm certainly not. But the idea is to balance out civil liberties with accountability, and that's a whole process.
Mandating treatment is a tough thing.
It is.
You have to protect society as a whole.
And personal.
I believe that's true. Yeah.
Okay,
Excellent.
good.
All right.
Yeah.
So I hope you got what you
Thank you so
needed. I
much.
hope it
Yes.
sounds all right.